Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Is Vermont more eccentric than other parts of New England? Are you more likely to meet a ghost in Montpelier than in Hartford? What weird legends still thrive among the Green Mountains? Well, hi friends, and welcome to the 129th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Paul, and I'm sorry to say Ben is not with us this week, but he is on a plane, I certainly hope, headed somewhere, I guess, between Chicago and Albuquerque, New Mexico. He'll be spending the rest of this week on the Navajo Reservation in the northeastern part of Arizona, and that's a long and interesting story that you will hear about on a future show, I'm sure. But before we welcome today's guest, let's do our weekly paranormal contest. None other than nobody correctly answered last week's question: in what Massachusetts town have witnesses reported a ghostly face staring up through the ice of a pond while skating on it? Well, that was a little tough, I suppose. The answer was Rehoboth, Massachusetts, southwest of Boston, and only a few miles east of Providence, Rhode Island. Well, let's make this week's question a little bit easier. In what Canadian province does Ogopogo live? Okay, that's we always try to come up with questions that don't make it too easy for you to search on the internet. So if you can spell Ogopogo, you can get the answer to that. As a matter of fact, even without the internet, my cat could answer that one. Anyhow, call us locally at 401-766-1240 or nationally at 800-449-1240. Here on ON 1240. Or email us at eno@onworldwide.com. If nobody gets it before the end of the show, drop a line to me at Ben. to Ben at behindtheparanormal.com. The winner gets a copy of The Vermont Monster Guide, co-authored by today's guest. Native Vermonter, paranormal expert, novelist, television personality, and national public radio commentator Joseph A. Citro has done a lot to keep New England's history and folklore alive. His 14 books, he'll correct me at the end of this is an old bio, his 14 books include 5 novels of suspense, 3 volumes of historical oddities, a collection of regional humor, 2 travel guides, and a co-edited book of essays. Joe's classic and best-selling Green Mountain Ghosts, Ghouls, and Unsolved Mysteries was the most comprehensive collection of offbeat Vermont lore ever assembled and is now in its 10th printing. There was Passing Strange, which includes one of my cases, Dark Tales, the Vermont Ghost Guide, and Curious New England. And now there's Weird New England and the Vermont Monster Guide. His novels, 3 of which have been optioned for movies, present a dark and mystical side of the Vermont experience. I'm thinking of some strange experiences I had in Vermont. Anyway, these novels include Shadow Child, Guardian Angels, The Gore, Lake Monsters, and Deus Ex. Since 1992, Joe's commentary series on Vermont Public Radio has featured the state's best-loved ghosts, monsters, madmen, and mysteries. I thought Rhode Island was the only place people could love madmen. Anyway, he is an expert in Vermont's occult lore, including spiritualism, and since becoming a professional writer in 1987, Joe has taught in local colleges, lectured widely, and appeared on regional and national radio and TV, and you've probably seen him on the Discovery and Travel channels. Joe's website, www.josephacitro, that's CITRO.com. Welcome to Behind the Paranormal, Joe. I should say welcome back.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Paul. Good to be with you again.
Always nice to be with you. Well, we don't tell... first of all, let me... let's begin with some of these stories. We seldom tell ghost stories on this show. We kind of tend to go deeper. But let's take some of the ones Joe has cataloged, because Joe is a deep thinker. He likes to look behind the paranormal, as it were, just as we do, and look at them clinically and critically, and as well as enjoy them, too. And I like that mixture that you give us, Joe, in your books. So let's get right to it. Tell us about the 516 ghost of Barton, Vermont, of course, being named after General William Barton from Rhode Island.
Right. Well, it has to do with a building that still stands there that was at one time a hotel. And the story is that the manager of the hotel was accused of some kind of malfeasance. I don't remember quite what it was, but I imagine it was borrowing from the cash register. And he was banished, and he, like so many people in those days did, he kind of vanished into the West and was never heard of again. But the rumor around town was that he had been wrongly accused. And after a certain amount of time passed, presumably enough time for him to have gone west, both literally and figuratively, people started noticing things in the hotel, like footsteps and voices and the sound of an old-fashioned cash register. And these echoes from the past apparently are still heard in that building, although now it's not used as a hotel anymore. And as I understand it, all the equipment is very modern and electronic, and yet every now and then someone will be startled to hear the clinking and bell-like sounds of an ancient cash register. Not a terrifying tale by any means, but one of those that I don't know. It seems like every town in Vermont and probably all over New England has a little story like that. Not a terror tale, but just a little historical imprint that causes us to remember something that may or may not have happened.
Yeah.
I love I hadn't heard that story of yours from Rehoboth about the face peering up through the frozen pond. I like that one a lot.
Well, the story. Well, just to, not to keep people guessing. The story, as I understand it, is and you know, this is a story from. Do you know Chip Robinson?
Yeah, I know. I know his book.
Yeah. Charles Turek Robinson, who is whom we've spoken on the phone several times. I feel as though I know him, but we've never met somehow.
Yeah.
He's from Rehoboth, and I have ancestral roots in Rehoboth, and it's full of interesting stories that sort of tweak the imagination. This particular pond is to this day a place where people come skating, and supposedly a little boy drowned there, and his face, when people see it, very often is alive, and it gives them. It's interesting because it gives them a feeling not of horror, but of pity. You know, and they sort of know what's happening. I find that's very interesting. And of course, I guess you have a certain sympathy for the point of view Ben and I use. We're probably the first, or among the first, paranormal investigators ever to apply the quantum theory literally to what we do, and the results are very interesting.
Yeah.
And so we might say, well, you're simply getting a vision of what's actually happening in this lake, because you know we're all kind of tied together, and as is time. So maybe in the case you just mentioned in Barton, which had a history of sort of funny goings on, and not just paranormally, but financially.
Yeah.
There was perhaps some connection. You know, what do you think of the notion of the residual haunting, as it's called, the idea that events can be recorded on the environment? I was one of the first advocates of that theory in the 70s, and I soon came to disbelieve it, at least in a lot of cases. What do you think of that?
Well, you know, I sort of wish you hadn't said that you disbelieve it, because I want to say that.
Okay.
I have a little trouble with it in the sense that, first, I have a whole sequence of troubles with the whole thing, ending up, I guess, with the idea of a residual haunting. Mm. But my series of troubles begin with the notion of ghosts in general. I don't know what they are, but at this point I don't think they're spirits of the dead.
Absolutely not.
And,
see, that's why I like to have you on now, and then once in a while I like to have somebody who agrees with me.
Well, I'll be happy to agree with you, at least about that. I was speaking at a middle school very recently, and of course the kids, you know, they're these little pre-pube kids, and they're just full of enthusiasm and wonder, and they're just great to deal with. And they're full of questions about monsters and ghosts, and they say, well, do you believe in ghosts? And I always have to say, well, you know, it depends what you mean by a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
And that will stop them cold, because these little kids, and maybe people in general, have just never stopped to think that there might be alternate explanations for these visions.
Well, yeah.
I call them. I'm willing to call them a ghost experience. But I'm not willing to say people see ghosts if what they're saying is I'm seeing, you know, a dead ancestor or something like that.
No, I agree. Oh, absolutely. Well, you know what scares me? I mean, little kids are one thing, but when you have people who are thought of as eminent experts, we have them on the show all the time, who believe the same thing that little kids do, That makes me nervous. And I've actually had, when I've proposed alternative theories, they've said, well, gee, I never thought of that. I mean, well, you've written 37 books. I mean, you never thought. Parroting 19th century spiritualism is essentially what they're touting, and that drives me nuts. I mean, maybe they're right. But, I mean, consider the alternate possibilities, which I think are far more exciting. So, anyway.
Well, that's why I like to talk to these young ones, because I like to get that alternate mode of thinking instilled just as quickly as I can.
No, absolutely right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But again, who really can be an expert in this field? That's another question I keep asking myself, because, as you said, people have been doing paranormal research for hundreds of years, and yet, how much closer are we to getting answers?
Well, that's the thing. For every answer you think you have 10 more questions, and the answer you probably think you have is wrong.
I know.
Well, as I'm always saying, our friend Lloyd Pye, that's my favorite quote of all time: "Is everything you know is wrong." That's why you.
Yeah.
That's where you have to begin.
That predates Lloyd Pye, as it turns out.
Oh, I know. He admitted that on the.
Yeah.
But I like Lloyd, so I give him credit for it.
Yeah. But it's a terrifying notion, and really that was one of the ideas that I was playing around with way back when I wrote that novel that you just mentioned called Deus Ex. I wanted to just kind of play with that idea that everything we see is not as we see it. Everything we think is not necessarily right, and those are horrifying thoughts, because we as weak and terrified human beings are always looking for things to cling to, whether it's God or the government or
the government. This is good heavens. Anyway, well, no, but you're right. I mean, science. What we don't really know anything. What did Lovecraft say? I'm trying to think his essay on the essence of horror in literature, I believe. I'm sure you know the book I mean. He was referring to any disruption in the normal flow of time and space as we perceive it is the beginning of horror, because that's what we have to cling to. If the sun did not come up in the east in the morning, and you woke up and you had 11 fingers instead of 10. I mean, that's the essence of horror. And we cling to a veneer of security, which is really false when you think of it.
I like the idea of things just going a little wrong. The light switch that is always turned on when you push it up suddenly turns on when you push it down.
Yeah.
the spoon that you're holding in your hand suddenly flexes.
Yes.
Whatever. Just these little disruptions in the norm.
Yeah.
If I can throw another quote back at you, it's from Charles Fort, who said, "I would never say that truth is stranger than fiction, because I've never had acquaintance with either."
I'm not familiar with that quote. Charles Fort, of course, being the originator deluxe of finding strange things in the news and writing whole huge books about it. I think he spent most of his life in the British Museum or in the New York Public Library. I think.
Yeah. Jotting down a collection of what he called the damned.
Yes.
Things that just didn't fit into conventional wisdom and conventional science.
Yeah, and the books are, as thick as the Bible, or more, so there was a lot of material to work with.
And I dare say that's what got us all started. I mean, certainly Fort was one of the first rungs on my ladder to the unknown, I guess. Absolutely.
Mine too. Unfortunately, very little known to the general public. But let's move on to the next thing here. This is I'm interested in the operatic attic, as you call it, of Enosburg Falls, a town founded by my great-great-great-great-granduncle. By the way.
Right. Yeah, you've got a lot of roots here in Vermont. That comes out little at a time every time I talk to you.
Yeah, it does. I'm really proud of it. Some of them are recent, some not.
You've got a whole town named after you.
Well, not me, but although there was a painting of him he was the image of my older brother, which I found. Talk about kind of like finding yourself with 11 fingers. Was an interesting General Roger. Was an interesting character. He had a notoriously big mouth. You can hear his descendants and relatives on the radio, of course. and he the British agents would seek him out, buy him a beer or two, and he'd spill the, he didn't mean any harm, but and then he also we're not supposed to be talking about history here, but he led the army in Vermont that pretended to resist the invasion from Quebec.
Yeah.
It was 1783 or 1782, and because actually the Quebecers and the Vermonters kind of liked each other. And so one of them, somebody actually got killed in a fake skirmish, and the general, a British general from Quebec, apologized to Eno for killing one of his men. Anyway, that's the kind of war you want. Anyhow, so what's going on with the operatic attic of Enosburg Falls?
Well, there's as is true in so many small New England towns, thanks to the old days, each had a little opera house or theater. And some of those still stand, and some of them have been renovated. The one in Enosburg Falls was renovated probably 10 or 20 years ago, brought back to its former splendor. And they like to think about the touring companies that came through. Apparently John Philip Sousa and his band played at the Enosburg Opera House. And over the years, people have been in and out, and people have been employed there. And the story that seems to have caught on is the story of I think a maintenance man or a carpenter whose name is so common among the ghostly population. His name is Willie, and he apparently was working in there alone one night and was trapped. Something fell on his leg and broke his leg, and he couldn't get out, and was in the attic of the opera house and just didn't make it till morning, I guess. Died during the night, and people found him. And afterwards, you can guess the rest of the story, because these all sort of unfold the same way. People in the opera house, sometimes in groups, more often when people are alone in the opera house, will hear some indication of Willie clomping around up in the attic. As far as I know, there haven't been any recent sightings. I had a friend, a great friend by the name of Lou Hill, who lived in Enosburg and was involved in the restoration of the opera house. And he was the one who told me the story and introduced me to some people who had acquaintance with Willie. But since then, Lou sort of passed on, and I don't have a reporter on site anymore, so I've kind of lost track of the ghostly goings-on at the Enosburg Opera House.
Oh, but he's not up in the attic performing Wagner or Puccini. No.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think I would have trouble, and probably you would too, finding an opera house or old theater in New England that didn't have some sort of quote-unquote ghostly phenomena going on here. And again, it brings us back to the idea of residual hauntings. And that's sort of a doctrine among many investigators, and I've had people seem absolutely horrified, that I questioned, this whole idea. To me, I mean, that's just where I would have. This is where the worlds join, and it can be. One of the reasons I don't believe in residual hauntings, Joe, is because I've actually gone into cases and changed the nature of them by interacting, albeit on a rare basis, with the people beyond the if you're going to call them membrane in their own world, who are going about their daily lives or cleaning the theater or whatever they're doing. And the thing has never been the same again. There have been several renowned cases that were thought of as residual or recordings or whatever. But then again, looking back on it, I think that the residual thing is just they don't have any other way to explain it. So
right, and I think the investigators are delighted to have a name for it. I don't know how long they've had that moniker, a residual haunting, but it kind of rolls off.
I'm afraid
it sounds very.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it just sounds very legitimate. Oh, well, that's a residual haunting. Yeah, right. And maybe there are such things. I don't know.
Yeah, there could be. I don't know.
You and I think, approach this in a slightly different way, and that is that you're more likely to get your feet wet, if you will. I'm more of a, although I've spent my time on site a fair number of times. Most of the work I do is kind of at a distance.
Yeah, no, well, we need good chroniclers.
Well, I see myself as sort of a theologian.
Okay.
But I collect. I chronicle. I love the stories. I like to see what patterns I can discover and what we can discover about ourselves from the stories that we tell.
Yeah, that brings me to another question. I mean, are you through? I didn't want to interrupt you.
Oh, I can go on and on.
Okay, well, so can I. Well, no, two questions arise. One is there's a certain amount of thinking among some of us old-timers in this field, and I've been doing this for 40 years, and you're not far behind that, whatever, there are a couple of other people. And the idea is we wonder, especially with things like EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, where people pick up supposedly, whatever they call them, spirit voices or whatever, how much of this is being produced by the investigator?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how much projection is going on that could be manifesting in the form of that recording or even phenomena such as people report in various cases. And I don't know, but there is some thinking in that direction, especially with EVPs. What say you?
Well, I've never really experienced the EVP. I've experienced other people's recorded EVPs that they've sort of cleaned up.
Yeah.
And as soon as they start cleaning them up, they become immediately suspect to me.
Yeah.
But I would like to take a friend who might be an electrical engineer or electronics expert and have him look at the equipment that's being used to record these EVPs, because I can't help but think that there's a lot of ambient electronic signals going through the air and through us all the time. And if these devices that they use to record the ESPs are little more than radio receivers, let's say with a rheostat that's going up and down through the electronic spectrum, obviously it's going to pick up things here and there across the spectrum. So my first suspicion is that these sounds are simply radio waves that are being kind of randomly collected by the devices.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very hard to accept that spirits, because I don't believe in spirits. So I find it very hard to believe that spirits are leaving any sort of coherent messages on any sort of electronic media. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Well, I agree with that. You know, my question with the whole spirit business, and especially with EVPs, is, okay, a spirit by definition has no body. First of all, I have a problem with that, because these things are coming across as people, and without your body, you're not a person. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe I'm being philosophical, but no body, ergo, no vocal cords. Therefore, where's the sound coming from? Yeah. You know, that sort of thing. So these are various issues that we all have with this stuff. But what bothers me is people don't ask the questions usually. And
it seems like they're just a little bit too quick to get the answer that they're looking for, and they don't want to embrace other possibilities. And it's the same with photography. The EVPs, people say, okay, well, we can't hear it with our human ears, but these sounds will be recorded on magnetic media, tapes or hard drives or whatever. Same thing with photography, right? We can't see them with our naked eye, but for some reason, ghosts, quote unquote, seem to be able to imprint on film and now on electronic media. It's weird. Yeah. So we kind of take ourselves out of the equation. But the machine will do it, but we can't do it, and that seems to me just backwards. I think the stuff's coming from us. I think we are.
Oh yeah. So you do have a certain sympathy, as do I, a certain sympathy with that point of view, because I have had the opposite problem. I've had cases where we have heard with our ears children laughing, and and it has not come out on the tape. Now again, this is 40 years ago, and we didn't have the stuff you have today. So maybe today.
This was your Barahack.
It's the Barahack case, yeah. But it's happened since then too, a few times. And we've also had things we've seen with the naked eye that have not come out on film. And, of course, the opposite happens all the time as well. And because, you study film emulsion and what is done, it picks up, spectra, light spectra that the eye does not, et cetera, et cetera. There are all sorts of theories. But, again, I think why wonder if some of that's not projected as well? Well, it's something that needs to be looked into. Let me give our numbers again. We are coming up on a break, but it's... here on WOON 1240. AM and 1240 and onworldwide.com on the internet, 401-766-1240, and nationally 800-449-1240. And our guest is Joe Citro, Vermont author and par excellence chronicler of the paranormal. So before we take our break, Joe, I also wanted to ask about something that it makes the second question I was going to ask, which is I wonder if sometimes the story is not made up to accommodate the phenomena or what people perceive as the phenomena. And I'm thinking of Emily's Covered Bridge in Stowe, to which I have absolutely no connection whatsoever, unlike the other story.
Yeah. Well, I think that would be a good example of creating a story and kind of retrofitting it to explain the phenomena.
Yeah.
I don't know how much time I have to tell this story. The briefest version of the story is that there's a covered bridge in Stowe, Vermont. It was made around 1850, and shortly after that, a young woman hanged herself on the bridge.
Do you know that for a fact?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, that's the story. I'm telling you the story.
Yeah.
And the story continues that she was waiting for a young man who never appeared, so she kind of overreacted and hanged herself rather than just going home. So the story is that she continues on the bridge, getting more and more angry year after year, and now as people in the vicinity of the bridge or people crossing the bridge are likely to have some kind of a confrontation with her, she could pull their hat off, not head. She could pull their hat off.
Head would be more exciting.
She could scream. Yeah, we haven't seen that one yet, but maybe she's not angry enough yet. It could still happen. People hear her whispering. You won't be able to make out exactly what she's saying. Sometimes she allegedly scratches animals or scratches cars, and you can see the claw prints. I've tried to validate this story. This gives us a wonderful opportunity to investigate a little history. So, yeah, the covered bridge was created around 1850. That's true. We can find that. We can even find the guy that built it, a guy by the name of John Smith from Moscow, Vermont. But there is no record anywhere of a young woman named Emily committing suicide on the bridge or anywhere else in Stowe. So I think what was happening there is I think weird things do happen around the bridge, and I can talk about that more later. But I think people needed an explanation why.
Yeah.
And that's where I think Emily came from. In fact, I even tracked down the woman who claims that she created the story of Emily around 1970. And interestingly enough, one can't find anything in print about the haunted covered bridge prior to 1970. So this is like one of Vermont's greatest haunts. It's probably the haunt that we're best known for, and yet there's no real substance to it.
Let me just back up a little bit here. Our wonderful producer here has gotten for us virtualvermont.com on the internet, and it's got, if you, I guess, click the right links, you can get a picture of the bridge here, Emily's Bridge in Stowe, Stowe Hollow, or Goldbrook.
Goldbrook Bridge, yeah.
Gives a description of the bridge, 50 feet, spanning Goldbrook, Covered Bridge Road. At least 3 dramatic stories about how the name Emily's Bridge came about, and of course, you've discussed that. In 1925, homely Emily fell in love with Donald, who got her pregnant. When her father insisted that he marry her, Donald killed himself here. Following the birth of twins, Emily did the same. Good Lord.
Yeah.
Talk about family dysfunctional, huh?
Yeah.
All right, so there are different. Yeah, I think that
everybody picks their own version of the story.
Exactly. I think it happens very, very often. More often. Thank you very much, Craig. Okay, we're going to take a commercial break here, and we'll be right back on Behind the Paranormal on ON 1240 and onworldwide.com. Stay with us.
New River Press is proud to sponsor tonight's segment of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Benjamin Eno. New River Press offers the best in unusual New Age books. Stand by the side of tonight's host, Paul Eno, as he battles poltergeists and helps suffering souls and families in the critically acclaimed books Faces at the Window and Footsteps in the Attic. Plunge deeper into the paranormal with Paul and learn about its influence on human history, its action in our daily lives, and its ultimate meaning for us in the best-selling Turning Home, God, Ghosts, and Human Destiny. Available now from New River Press, publishers of unusual books. Visit newriverpress.com, amazon.com, or your favorite bookstore. And set for release late this year in one of the most unusual books on the subject ever written, Paul gives us Dancing Past the Graveyard, What Ghosts Have to Say About God.
Okay, we are back behind the paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno today. Without the Ben, I'm afraid. He's on a plane headed for Arizona. That'll make an interesting story in itself, where he's going and what he's doing. And our guest is Joseph A. Citro, Vermont personality, folklorist, television, radio, novelist, you name it, Joe does it. And also a very old and dear friend of mine. So, Joe, we were talking about Vermont ghosts and some of the perhaps true stories behind them, or speculating about where they may have come from. And I was interested in one particularly here called the Orb of the Valley in Fairfield, Vermont. What's that about?
The Orb of the Valley, yeah, it's a little difficult to classify, so I can put the story into the Vermont Ghost Guide, and I can also put it into the Vermont Monster Guide,
cool.
Because this phenomenon is somewhat ill-defined. But it's apparently it's a ball of light, described as being about the size of depending who you talk to, a soccer ball or a basketball, that will float around in this particular piece of woods, and people will see it at a distance, passing among the trees in this area that's known colorfully as the Lost Nation area. People will see it moving among the trees, but it'll sometimes approach people. And if you take a step back toward it, most people don't do that, by the way, but if you were to, it will then withdraw. So it seems to, and it also seems to kind of, at a distance, pursue people through the woods at the same rate of speed that they're traveling, usually beginning at a walk and ending at a run. And after a while, it'll just kind of vanish back into the trees. There's a very famous, and for, as far as I can tell, absolutely true story of a professor by the name of Nixon, who had a cabin up in the Lost Nation area. He was sitting in his cabin one day, looking out the door. He left the cabin door open, and he was just looking out at the woods and the landscape. And the orb came drifting by in front of the cabin. So he walked over to the door and invited it in. And as he tells the story, it stopped, and I don't know. You can't really say it took a few steps, but it floated the equivalent of a couple steps near the door, as if it was going to accept the invitation. And then, with the speed of a UFO, just took off into the forest. Nobody seems to know what it is. Some people call it a spirit. Some people think it's got some UFO connections. Some people think it's an earth light. Some people think it's ball lightning. It does behave a little bit like the way we understand ball lightning behaves, but not exactly, because it doesn't. It never goes to ground. Apparently, it just floats around as if it's looking for something.
Yeah, well, this ball lightning doesn't generally last.
Yeah.
Let's just say, with St. Elmo's fire, there are all sorts of phenomena that can occur. What is the the geology of this area at all? I mean, does it seem limited to a certain area, or does it? What's its range?
It's limited to that area that's called the Lost Nation area, and I'm afraid that back when I researched the story, I was looking at the geology, but for the life of me, can't remember what I found. Well, I can tell you there's a lot of rock under the state, but I'm not just sure what kind of faults and tensions there are underground up there. And that's another case I really haven't looked at for a long time either.
Yeah. What nation is it that was lost? I mean,
this is it's probably a nation of Native Americans.
Yeah.
This is a designation that you'll find here and there throughout New England. People may. I think there's a Lost Nation in New Hampshire. I think there's one in Maine. People will go, oh, it's up in the Lost Nation area.
Interesting.
And yeah, but that's what you do, Paul. You ask the question that nobody bothers to ask.
That's
what
right.
What nation was it?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. I frustrate the heck out of people that way. Now, this brings up the entire question of orbs, because orbs are the darlings of the feral ghost hunters today. They all come out in photographs and spirits, or here's Johnny, come back, to attend the wedding, and all this rigmarole. What do you think orbs are? Or do you have any idea?
Dust, insects, camera straps.
Uh-huh.
In some cases, cigarette smoke.
Yeah, snowflakes. I've seen snowflakes.
Yeah, they could probably be. They could very well be snowflakes. I've got a whole series of pictures that I use when I'm talking to classes of youngsters in high school and middle school, where you can see the orbs, but you can very clearly see what's causing the orb.
Yeah.
And I just ask the young ones to just kind of transpose that thinking onto orbs that are presented as being a little bit more mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've never seen an orb that that I would call supernatural. Although as you say, they do seem to be the darlings of the paranormal investigators.
Yeah, I have to say that I have seen some that I would have difficulty explaining. There have been a number that I've seen with the naked eye. I'm thinking particularly of a cemetery in New Hampshire. And I'm not one who thinks cemeteries are particularly active. Generally, I find them very peaceful. It all depends on the nature of the soil. Generally, how many EM fields they'll conduct. Electromagnetics are the basis of pretty much everything. And there's one in New Hampshire I'm thinking of. I'm not even going to name it because it's already a hangout, where there's an old settlement next to it where you can hear farm implements, much like the Barahack case, people talking occasionally, this sort of thing. And there are orbs that will follow you around. And I've seen this in a number of locations, and I think I have a theory. Of course, obviously I can't prove it, but I think that orbs, the ones that are not dust specks and things, snowflakes, could be plasma-based life forms, and these have been speculated upon by astrobiologists. Plasma-based life forms rather than carbon-based that live and feed around the boundaries of worlds. I mean, where worlds seem to come together. I mean, that's where I find them the most. But again, one does have to be extremely careful of dust on the lands or any of these things. So that's just one shot in the dark that I kind of take. And just when you think you have a line on what they may be, they change. But I've had them follow me around, change colors, and act in a relatively intelligent manner. But then again, so does ball lightning.
Well, I'd love to go there with you and stake it out to see if I could see them with my naked eye, because I've never had that experience. I've never seen them with my naked eye. I've seen them in hundreds of photographs, and it's very very easy to dismiss a photograph because there's just one layer of unreality between me and the phenomenon itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we'll get together and see if we can't, corral some of this stuff.
We could. I'd love to hang around a cemetery with you. I think that would be great.
I don't usually hang around cemeteries. I don't find them all that. I like cemeteries. I love to look at epitaphs. There are certain ones that are negative. I think it's because of the people who are associated with them. I don't know, but there's. I don't know. Well, let's talk about that off the air. Maybe we get something going. We got a lot. Ben and I have a lot coming up TV wise. Maybe we can do something together.
Could we flip back to that Rehoboth story for a minute?
Yeah, sure.
That's been kind of playing around in the back of my mind. I think it was Charles Turek Robinson and Rehoboth that gave birth to that story about the red-headed hitchhiker. Do you know that story?
Oh, the famous urban legend / archetypal hitchhiker story?
Yeah, I wanted to. I know you're supposed to be doing the interviewing here, but
no. Hey, it's your show.
I've heard that story. It's a terrifying story. As far as I know, it first appeared in Charles Turek Robinson's book, The New England Ghost Files. And I've talked to a lot of people, and I've never found anybody who's had any experience with that story. It's always, well, I knew somebody whose cousin's brother's uncle's aunt.
Urban legend, yeah.
Had it, yeah. And I just wondered, what I wanted to ask you was, because you're generally down in that neck of the woods more than I am, is there anything other than urban legend to that story? Is there some?
Well, all I can tell you is I've heard it all over the world from various people, and that's one of the characteristics of an urban legend, is that you hear, it was my cousin's friend's brother-in-law, that sort of thing, as you say. I will tell you this, Chip Robinson is one of the most thorough and painstaking writers I know. I would have a real problem believing that he wouldn't put something, but then he hears things secondhand too. He's a chronicler as well. He doesn't, throw himself into the deep end of investigations. He does collect things, but he's a very thorough interviewer as well. So I have heard that story from other, because I have friends who live in Rehoboth, relatives even, and they said, well, I heard that from so and so. But again, it's the urban legend thing. I have never talked to anyone in Rehoboth who actually had the experience, and as a matter of fact, in 40 years of paranormal investigation, I've never talked to anyone who had the hitchhiker experience except one person in England, an old man in a little town in the middle of nowhere, who said that as a child, he was in the car when his father picked up a hitchhiker that disappeared. But in 40 years, that's the only thing I've encounter I've had with someone who actually had the experience.
So it seems like among all the fairly new New England ghost stories, that's one that's really taken on some traction.
It does persist. Well, it has a very haunting quality beyond the hauntability, so to speak, of some of the others. To have someone in your car, you have a conversation, and then bingo, they go. It's like waking up with 11 fingers. It shakes the notion of the reality that keeps us secure in our minds. I think it does what Lovecraft does. It disrupts time and space, and there you go. Well, the legend often continues that not only does the hitchhiker disappear, but that leaves behind a handkerchief, and the guy goes back to does some research and goes back to the house and said, your daughter left this, and the guy, or the woman breaks into tears saying, oh, she died, 3 years ago or something.
But that is her handkerchief.
Yeah, and it is. That's a part of the story that often is a tail on the usual urban legend. So
yeah, the female hitchhiker stories usually have a certain amount of pathos to them, and
yes.
This redheaded guy is a real element of terror, I think, because a big part of the story that Charles Turek Robinson tells is that the hitchhiker will talk to and laugh at people through their car radios, and that when they do the logical thing and speed away from this horrific apparition, they'll glance out the passenger window and the face will still be in the window as they're tearing down the road.
I've heard that version too. Yeah. Well, the real question here is, and as you know, Joe, when in folklore, there was always some grain of truth that starts the fairy tale or the urban legend or whatever. Something happened to somebody that was in some way related to what the story says. So I would like to know what's the root story of this. But when you look at very often, look at the story of disappearances. Was it the John Lang or Joseph Lang story in Tennessee? Where Ambrose Bierce wrote a story called "The Difficulty of Crossing a Field." I think it was Bierce.
It was.
Yeah, and the fellow's walking across the field in the presence of his family to greet someone who was coming up the driveway in a horse and buggy, and the guy disappeared right in front of everyone. And so there were other embellishments later on, but it turned out I researched it personally, and other people have too, and I found the same thing. There was a bored journalist who was staying in that town in Tennessee, and sort of made the thing up.
Yeah.
Well, there are legitimate cases of people disappearing in front of others. That's the granddaddy, and that was made up by some bored reporter.
And I think we always have to look for that in stories that are placed somewhere in the 1900s, because there was a fair amount of that journalistic tomfoolery that was going on.
Oh, if anything, time was worse than today in journalism. It was then.
Yeah. I tried a little experiment in the Vermont Ghost Guide, and I made up one of the stories in the Vermont Ghost Guide. I just created it. Mm-hmm. And I told people about it in the introduction to the book. But nobody reads introductions, right?
Nope.
So they got to this story. It's the story that's called The Midnight Cow. And it's a story that takes place down in Shoreham one night when Farmer Farrington's cow escaped the pasture and was standing in the road as a bread truck full of hamburger rolls barreled down Route 22 and ran into the cow and killed it. And
that's and
now people will still see. First, they'll see the white spots on the cow at a distance, and as they get closer, they'll realize that the white spots are actually part of a configuration of a cow standing in the highway. I made it up, and anyone who had read the introduction would know that there was a made-up story, and there was so much foolishness in that one.
Okay.
So what's happened is that story has come back again and again and again as if it's a real ghost story. It's been in a few newspapers. There's been at least one other book of New England ghost stories, and I feel a little bit guilty, but at the same time, it makes me understand how these stories do get started and how they take root and how they blossom.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, and we learn a couple things from that, right? We read the introductions.
Yes.
And we learn, look at the sources, because I bet you a lot of, not all, I don't want to come off as super skeptic here. I mean, I definitely acknowledge that people have weird experiences, and I've had a few myself. But in this particular case, there are people out there telling about the Midnight Cow, and, we know that they didn't read the introduction.
That's just amazing. Well, again, it brings us back to the idea, are they projecting, or are they simply imagining? And thanks a lot, Joe, because I'm always on the air here defending the integrity and the wisdom of eyewitnesses. So I don't know, but again, it depends on the situation. There was, and I'm having a senior moment. It slipped my mind. There was one story I thought of that was very similar to that. But I don't know. I don't know if I would have the gall to plant anything in the book introduction or not. Although the fact that nobody reads introductions, you're making me feel badly, because I spent 6 months on the introduction of my next book.
Well, I had the same experience with the introduction to Passing Strange. I worked really hard on it. And I'd say to people, how'd you like the introduction? Oh, I didn't read it.
No.
I guess there was a little element of revenge in my Midnight Cow story.
Well, I can see it. Well done. And it's even fewer people read prefaces. So if I was going to ask you to write the preface to my next book, maybe I won't bother.
Well, they wouldn't read it anyway.
Yeah, anyway. Well, so how about, let's time for one more here. How about the Blue Ghost of Plymouth? What was that about?
Well, that's again, it's more folklore. This is folklore. Plymouth, Vermont is not only where President Calvin Coolidge came from, but it was also the site of Vermont's gold rush. Back in the 1840s and 1850s, somebody oddly discovered gold in Plymouth, and so there was a big rush and a lot of mines opening up, and a lot of rivers being rerouted and stuff. The remains are still there. You can still go and see the old gold mines and stuff. What you can't see is the gold. But anyway, the Blue Ghost has to do with a miner who got his claim jumped, and he was, I guess he was strangled and turned blue. And after that, sort of remained that way. And he would, appear to people that seemed to be threatening his claim, that little spot of earth where his gold was. And he would come at them or come out of the trees or actually rush them, and he would be a blue-colored specter. So that's the story. And you know where I heard that story? At Camp Plymouth. Camp Plymouth was Boy Scout camp when I was a kid.
Really?
So do you know any Boy Scout camps that are ghost-free?
No, there's always one, at each camp. As a matter of fact, the campfire ghost is obviously a fixture of Boy Scout life as well as everybody else's, I guess. But what struck me about that story was the idea of the blue color of this. A lot of the early photographs that we took on cases that our Kodak Associated Photo Lab said were anomalous were blue images, which was chalked up to something electrical. Electrical charges or whatever, or the plasma. But that hasn't happened in the past 20 years. I guess they changed. There's some changes to the manufacturing of film emulsion and
Is it just a switch to digital in 20 years?
A lot of it's been a switch to digital. Yeah, it's everything comes out kind of whitish now, plasma-like, or sometimes very bright. And the trouble without having a negative, it's difficult sometimes to analyze properly. Although now digital techniques have been developed to do so. But the changing nature of photography has brought about the changing nature of allegedly paranormal images too. And that's been a pain in the neck kind of to follow, because you have to keep up with that.
Yeah, so, and that images can be so easily manipulated now.
Oh, that's the problem. And somebody's going to believe it. It's like the cow thing. If I were to put Godzilla or Mothra into a picture, somebody's going to buy it.
Yeah.
And that disconcerts me. And of course, a lot of this field is full of charlatans and showmen, and they'll do anything, and you can't rely on their honesty. So that's the other problem. But the blue thing kind of caught my attention on that.
Yeah. I think it's just like somebody's added creativity. I think,
probably.
If the guy had frozen to death, they might have said the same thing. He turned blue, and then when he came back.
Well, speaking of freezing to death, I didn't want to let another show pass without talking about the famous freezing of old people in the winter. Was that something to do with Obamacare, or I mean, tell us about that.
Well, I thought that's where we were going when we were talking about the face under the ice.
Oh yeah. Well, we got there. Took the scenic route.
Well, this was a story that was told around Vermont when I was a kid, and I had people tell me the story as if it were true. It has to do with a diary that was discovered in the late 1800s, and in the diary it was disclosed that in a certain impoverished settlement somewhere to the northeast of Montpelier, up around Calais, Vermont, there was a big family of very poor people, and there was the problem of how to get all the people through the long, cold winter nights, because winters were much worse back in those days, and the families were often bigger, and there were old people and infirm people in these families that really didn't contribute to growing the food supply. So this family had come up with a unique solution. Rather than doing any sort of euthanasia, they found some method of actually freezing the old people, freezing them and bringing them back in the spring. The story was, as I said, when I was a kid, there were people around who told that story as if it were true, and I think a lot of people in Vermont actually believed it. A guy by the name of Morris, I can't remember his first name, did an article about it for the biggest newspaper in the state, the Montpelier Argus and Patriot. And as soon as it came out in print, it got picked up by other newspapers and magazines.
Mm-hmm.
The Rutland Herald, Yankee Magazine, a bunch of books that went all over the world. I think people from around the world were sort of looking askance at Vermonters for these weird primitive rituals that we performed. And apparently the University of Vermont got inquiries from all around the world about their cryogenics program. Because this story comes so close to being true. It's like right on the edge of possible, that you could freeze people and you could thaw them out. Turns out, of course, that it was just the product of a yarn-in session from a bunch of old Vermonters. Apparently what they would do is they'd get together in the absence of television and DVDs and radio. They'd actually sit around and talk. And one of the things they do is they make up lies. They have these lying competitions that they called yarn-in sessions, yarning, telling a yarn.
Yeah.
And this guy, Morse, created it and told the story and chilled people often enough so that his kids encouraged him to write it down, and he did, and it got published in the paper. Everybody in the area knew it was Morse's story, so...
Be careful what you say. You never know where it's going to go. Oh,
but
boy.
this caught on, and people believed it, and people apparently there are still people who believe it. I know when Judson Hale was working on his book on New England, he came up to Vermont to try to track down the sources of that story. He found some elderly couple in North Montpelier, and he asked the old guy, do you believe the story? And he said, certainly do. He was very emphatic, absolutely believed it. And his wife said, well, the only part I doubt is the thawing out.
Well, on that note, we're running out of time here, but that's a perfect way to end that story. Joe, just briefly, tell us about what you're working on. Tell us about your books. Where can people get them, and what are you doing? What are you working on now?
Well, the most recent book, of course, is the Vermont Monster Guide, which was named one of the top 10 cryptozoological books of 2009.
It is darn good.
And I've got a couple of things that are under film option right now that I'm collaborating on. One of my short stories and one of my novels. And so I'm working with the producers on those. I'm not writing anything right now because I'm preparing to go on vacation.
Vacation, I remember that.
I kind of remember it myself. I haven't been on a vacation for years and years, so I think I'm going to go. I'm going to go for maybe a month to somewhere where it's really warm.
Well, let's
and
see,
come
that'd
back
be
and
the
tackle
equator
something.
at this point, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the Greek islands.
Cool.
Yeah.
I mean, warm.
Yeah,
Well,
warm. It's warm. It's going to be nice. And
That's
then,
excellent.
Then I'll find something else. I'll find another story to do when I come back.
Well, wherever you go, make sure you stay in touch.
Absolutely.
I've always got crazy ideas of stuff we can do together here and work on.
Well, I think we should definitely do something together, and we'll both come out of it with two versions of the same story.
That's right. The urban legends all. Joe, thank you so much. It's always a wonderful pleasure to have you. We'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right. Okay, folks, we're coming down to the end of our hour here. Remind you, BehindTheParanormal.com is our show website. You can get all sorts of stuff, all the dirt on our ghosts, I should say guests, coming and going, and all sorts of information about Ben and me. Now, on our regular Sunday show tomorrow at 7 p.m., Eastern, 4 Pacific on CBS Radio, NewSkyRadio.com, we'll dive into one of the weirdest paranormal subjects of all, the doppelganger. It's a realm where ghost hunters generally fear to tread, so check that out. Check out our website again for the cities where CBS broadcasts that and where you can hear it on the internet. So thanks to our sainted producer, Craig Pelletier, and our host station, WOON 1240 in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. And we'll see you next Sunday, April 24th, when our guest will be Peter Robbins, renowned UFO expert and co-author of Left at Eastgate, a British bestseller and a definitive book on the spectacular Rendlesham Forest UFO landings of 1980. Peter was one of the panelists on our 3-hour CBS radio special last Sunday that I'm told drew over 3 million listeners. It's next Saturday at 11 Eastern, 8 Pacific, and everything in between, right here again on WOON 1240 and ONWorldwide.com. In the meantime, we leave you with a quote attributed to some old Vermonter: "Don't talk unless you can improve the silence." See you next week.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.